episode 3 of the Unhitching Hour. The Unhitching Hour, how the law works when your relationship doesn't. My name is Reid Aronson. I'm a divorce lawyer in Manhattan. I'm a partner in Aronson, Mayevsky, and Sloan. And this is my lovely wife, Vanessa.
I'm Vanessa Aronson. I am not a lawyer, but I like to have opinions on things that I don't know anything about.
She does, especially when she doesn't know anything about.
So I'm excited to be a part of the Unhitching Hour.
And that's what this is all about. It's all about educating people and letting them know exactly what the rules are, what the rules of the road are. So hopefully they can figure out and plan their own lives. So this week we're shifting gears a little bit. The first couple of weeks have been about sort of child custody, that kind of thing. Now we're going straight into rich people's money.
Rich people's money.
Well, mostly rich people's money.
Okay.
Because you don't tend to fight over money in prenuptial agreements if you don't have a little bit of money. So what we're talking about today is prenuptial agreements, and specifically when are they enforceable, at least in New York. Because I would say that when I tell people that I'm a divorce lawyer, one of the first things that they will often, one of the more common questions that I'll get is, do people really do prenups, and how many people do prenups, and do they really stand up in court, and how does that all work? So that's what we're going to talk about today. So shall we go to our, so the format, as those of you who may have joined us for our first couple episodes, is I'm going to give the facts, or I'll have a little video of the facts of the case.
Okay.
That we're going to be talking about. That is sort of a jumping off point. Vanessa's then we're going to talk through sort of Vanessa's view as to not necessarily the law, but sort of what seems fair, what seems right, what seems the appropriate thing to do. Then we'll talk about what the court actually did. And then we'll sort of talk a little bit about what that means for people and for how the law works and how it, the system of our little system happens. Today, it's a little bit different. We're going to do two cases. Two cases, because I just thought that it would help to maybe see a little bit of a compare and contrast.
Okay.
So without further ado, let's go to our first case. This week's first case is called Baracus v. Baracus. It's from Manhattan in 2012. Deborah and Victor are getting married. In fact, they're getting married in 2 weeks. The rings are ready, the guests have been invited, the band has been picked out, and this is when Victor decides to say he wants a prenuptial agreement. So he brings Deborah to a lawyer's office and he presents her with a prenuptial agreement that says if the two of them get divorced, Deborah gets no property, she gets no alimony, and she has to return all of the gifts Victor has ever given her. Deborah shows this to a lawyer that she met today that Victor hired for her. And this lawyer says, this agreement's unfair, don't sign it. But Deborah wants to get married, and the wedding's in 2 weeks, so she signs it. So Deborah and Victor get married. They're married for 15 years. They have 2 children together, and they get divorced. So after seeing a prenuptial agreement the first time 2 weeks before the wedding, signing it against the advice of her lawyer, and after all those years of marriage, Victor walks away with millions of dollars, and Deborah gets basically nothing and gets no alimony under the agreement.
Wow.
So does that any questions about the facts there? So you've got a couple who are going to get married in 2 weeks. He brings her into a lawyer's office, says, let's get a prenuptial agreement. Here you go. Here's a lawyer that I found for you. Here are the terms. She gets no property. She gets no alimony. She has to return any gifts that he's ever given to her. The lawyer that he hired for her says, don't sign this. It's a bad idea. She signs it anyway. 15 years later, she hasn't been working. They get divorced. She basically walks away with nothing.
Wow.
So what do you think? Do you think a court should uphold that agreement and enforce it?
Okay, well, I'm intrigued by the point that you called out specifically, that the lawyer was chosen by her fiance and paid for by her fiance. And I'm curious if that is that normal, or is that specific to this case?
I would say it's pretty normal for I wouldn't say it's normal to just show up and say, hi, this is your lawyer.
Okay.
But it's definitely normal for the party who really wants the agreement, right? Usually that's going to be the case. One party wants it more than the other, to say, look, here's a list of people, right? Because not everybody knows a divorce lawyer. Maybe the person already has somebody that they can talk to who can recommend people. Here's a person, or here's some people that we recommend, and I'll pay for it, right? Yeah. So that's definitely something that happens. Probably most. I don't have a statistical analysis, but probably most of the time in my experience.
Okay. The other interesting part is the fact that they didn't even know that they wanted a prenuptial agreement until 2 weeks before the wedding, and it didn't say like how many days before the wedding that it was signed.
It was signed the same day.
It was signed the same day.
So she came in, she was presented to her, and she signed it the same day.
Is there any? I don't know. I feel like this would be a really good time for the law to have like an amount of time between when you sign. When
a cooling off period.
A cooling off. Well. There is precedent for it. In New York State, I remember when we got married, we signed our wedding or our license, and you couldn't get married that same day. Is that called a cooling off period? I don't know if that's what it's called. There's some sort of like, are you sure piece. And I'm curious does that exist at all in prenuptial agreements? Like, can you sign a prenuptial agreement at 9 o'clock in the morning and get married at 10 o'clock in the morning?
I'm asking you what you think. What you think is fair?
Well, I think that maybe there should be in prenuptial agreements. And then I'm also curious about how do we know that the lawyer told her not to sign it?
Because he was caught. My understanding is that he put in an affidavit saying that.
Because he knew it was so incredibly terrible.
He said it was wow. in his view. Look, I haven't read it, so I'm not opining myself. But the lawyer who was hired for her told her, and she acknowledged that he did this, told her, this is so unfair, you shouldn't sign it.
You shouldn't sign it, but she did anyway.
She signed it anyway.
And do we have any idea as to her other, like, were her mental facilities intact at the time? I guess they must have been, because she couldn't have gotten married.
There's no indication. I don't think she ever claimed that she had any sort of mental illness or issue. She did. She was an immigrant from Guyana.
Okay.
It's not stated in the opinion whether she had issues with the English language or not. So I can't presume that. But she did claim like, oh, this was a thing. So she's not familiar with these kinds of documents. She didn't really understand it, she claims. That's
a big deal. I feel like that's a really big deal. If she claims she didn't understand it at the time.
I don't understand it. I don't think she said like I didn't understand it in the sense that I don't understand English. I think more she didn't necessarily understand the full implications of it.
Well, but yeah, I think that's huge. I don't think you can sign a document if you don't fully understand the full implications of it. And then my last sort of question to you, I know you said I need to tell you what I think, but my last question to you is just a reminder. This is in New York State, and under New York State law, if they didn't have a prenuptial agreement, what would she be entitled to?
I don't know. I can't. I've never looked at the finances in this case, so I don't know.
Oh, it's not like a cut and dry.
It's not cut and dry.
Okay.
But it would be more. It would be not nothing. Okay. And she certainly wouldn't have to give him back gifts that he had given her before the marriage. At the very least, even gifts he had given her during the marriage would be equally shared.
Marital property.
Right, would be marital and shared. So that's the fact that if he gives her a diamond ring during the marriage, she doesn't get any part of that. On divorce, that's a lot. So it's clear she got much, much less than she probably would have gotten. Now they weren't married. Oh no, excuse me. They were married 15 years. So she would have gotten, again, I can't tell you exactly how much, because it's not like it's stated in the opinion. Yeah. Here's what she would get and here's what she got under the agreement, but it's potentially in the millions of dollars.
Could we go back and just look at that last piece one more time?
We can try to do anything. I can't promise.
No. Just this last slide, so I can see. You don't have to start the video.
All right.
Just so we can see one more time. So, just to lay down the facts of the case, Deborah and Victor getting married, and 2 weeks prior, he says, suddenly, I want to get a prenup. Victor hires a lawyer who tells Deborah the prenup that he came up with is totally unfair, but she signs it anyways. Mm-hmm. And then after 15 years, the question is this prenuptial agreement, like, should this prenuptial agreement hold? Okay. I really think the crux of this particular case should be on whether or not, if she can prove that she really didn't understand what a prenuptial agreement is. I think if she could prove that for whatever reason, culturally or a language barrier, that she just didn't understand the implications of the prenuptial agreement, then it shouldn't hold. But if they can't prove that, as much as I feel really, really bad for Deborah, I sort of think that that's what they signed, right? And she had a lawyer and she went against the lawyer's advice and she signed it. I feel like if signing something that you regret later doesn't hold up, then what's the point in signing anything at all?
Even though it was 2 weeks before, and even though there was all this, you're going to have pressure, right? The ring's going to have been picked out, the band is going to be there.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I would create a law in which there needs to be some time, but I don't think there is. I think, frankly, you can meet someone and get married in a matter of weeks. Like, that's allowed, and people get married for a lot of different reasons. So I feel, as much as it breaks my heart to say this, unless Deborah can really prove that she did not understand what a prenuptial agreement was and the implications it would have on her in the future, I gotta side with the prenuptial agreement.
So
sorry, Deborah.
So that's pretty much what the court does, at least halfway.
Okay.
So the court looks at the two pieces, the property piece and the alimony maintenance piece separately.
When you say does, are you saying in this case, this is what they did?
In this case, applying the law of the state of New York, this is what they did. And they looked at and the law in New York says, look, we want people, and we talked about this a little bit last week with the agreements regarding frozen embryos, right? We want to encourage people to set up their own affairs, to figure things out for themselves and not leave it for the courts. And so if we're going to do that, we have to honor what people say and what they sign it, except if it's in really extreme circumstances, right? Okay. Except if really extreme circumstances, if it's unconscionable, that's the phrase, right? If it shocks my conscience, and what that means for anybody might be different. And they say, look, yeah, it's not fair. It's not a deal we would have made. It's a deal that she looks at and probably regrets regarding the property elements of it. But she had a lawyer. The lawyer gave her advice. She made a decision. And we're not going to go back and sort of retroactively undo that decision, because people make decisions all the time, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for bad reasons. But we're not going to undo everything just because, oh, shoot, it's not fair.
Yeah.
Now, on the alimony, so the spousal support side, the test is a little bit more stringent.
Okay.
Right? Courts aren't just going to sort of say, well, you made a deal. They're also going to look and they're going to say, okay, well, what does that look like now? In the light of the current circumstances, not just how it may have looked back then, but in light of the current circumstances, how it looks now, is this something we can live with?
Yeah.
Is this unconscionable now? Not just then, but now. And they looked and they said, look, this is a 50-year-old woman who has not worked because she's been taking care of this guy's kids. She is now in a position where she still has 2 young children that she's raising. And we need the trial court, to really take a close look at whether right now this is something that we can tolerate.
Right.
Because if ultimately she's going to turn out to have to go on welfare, it's no good. That's no good. We're not going to let that happen. So that's what they say. So they say the property stuff is fine. She has to live with it. She doesn't get any property. She has to give back all of these gifts. But on the maintenance, the alimony, the spousal support, we've got to figure that out in the light of everything else. How much child support is she going to get? Can she get a job or not? All those sorts of things. And that's they leave for another day for the trial court to decide.
Okay. Ooh. we've got some questions that have come in, but I need to sip.
Okay.
Sorry.
How far in advance of the wedding do you recommend we start working on prenups? What about child support? Okay, so first, how far in advance of the wedding do you recommend we start working on prenups? You really should start as early as possible, because the fact of the matter is the closer to the wedding that you're going to get, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in the next case, but the closer you get, obviously, the more stressful it's going to get, the more difficult it's going to get, the more emotionally, setting aside the legality of it, the more emotionally fraught it's going to be. Right? You know, if you're trying to come to something, you don't want the objective, the goal should be that you put that at some point you sign the prenuptial agreement, you put it in a drawer, and you never have to think about it ever again. And the sooner you can do that, the better. Another question, what about child support?
Yeah.
In New York, and it may be different in other places, you can't, similar to child custody, you can't make an agreement about child support that's ultimately binding. Because the child support is really the right of the child. And, you know, you sitting here can't bargain away a child's rights for later on. Now, there are ways to do that where you could say, sort of, for an example, you know, you'll have a section on a prenup about child support. And it'll say, if at the time that we get divorced, both parties want to opt into this, we can do that. Right?
Oh,
you sort of leave like, hey, maybe this will be real good for you. But you can't be binding, right? So it would sort of be like, hey, if you want, you can get X number of dollars a month in child support, because you're sort of at that point, it's like you can now see things in the light of how they look, and then the court can look at it and say, okay, that seems reasonable. You know, that number seems fair. It seems fair for the children.
So it's like you can come up with an idea, like a hypothetical idea of child support in the prenup. And then similar to last week, it's like a two keys in the submarine situation where this was our plan. This was our hypothetical plan when divorce was not on the horizon. And now that it is, let's look at what brilliant idea we thought we had back then and see if we both still agree with it.
And more or less. And the person who might be paying, you might still bind them even if they don't want to be. But not the person who would be getting the money, not for the children. What if there was another motive for getting married, like she was pregnant and religious, and it would have been against her culture not to get married?
Ooh, that's a really good. I was thinking of, given my background, when you said she was from Guyana, I was like, ooh, is there a citizenship component in here that could make the power balance a little bit unequal?
Yeah.
But that's such an interesting thought. What happens if there's other pressures that would make it like that's an exactly great or exactly a clear situation? So
I mean, the answer to that question is every case is different, but as a general matter, as we saw in this case, courts are really not, unless it's real bad, and everything's going to add up. You're going to think about everything. But unless it's real bad, courts are hesitant to sort of undo it and say, oh, well, you didn't really know what you were doing. We assume that two people who are of legal age to make a contract, you make a decision, and they're generally going to hold you to it. Now,
one more question on that note was, what is an example of when it's really bad, of an unconscionable prenuptial agreement?
So maybe that's a good segue for our next the next one. The second case for today is called Sioffi Petrakis v. Petrakis, Long Island in 2013. Elizabeth is getting married to Panagiotis. They've been negotiating a prenuptial agreement for a while, but it's now 4 days before the wedding. And Panagiotis is done. He says, sign the prenup. And if you don't sign the prenup, I will call off the wedding. Woof. But, he's got a little velvet around that glove. He says, look, I promise everything we get after the marriage will be shared. And once we have children, I will tear up the prenuptial agreement. Now, none of these things get into the actual document, but he does say them. So what does the actual agreement say? Well, Elizabeth gets a third of one of his businesses. She gets up to $25,000 a year per year of the marriage, and on top of that, and she gets some alimony. So a little bit more than you saw in the Baracus case. So again, just to recap, They negotiate an agreement over a long period of time. 4 days before the wedding, Panagiotis says, sign or it's off. Elizabeth gets some property and alimony, and he also promises that he will rip up the agreement if they have children, which, of course, he doesn't do. All right, so we have here...
I don't know if you stopped sharing.
Oh, did I stop sharing? Yeah, I stopped sharing.
Oh, okay.
So we have here, it's a little bit, perhaps, the terms of it, the underlying terms are not quite as tough, but maybe there's some, there was a longer negotiation, but on the other hand, there was this pressure, and then there were these promises that were made external to the document. So what do you think? Do you think that this should be upheld?
So, because I read something recently, including an op-ed that you wrote, Reid, that talked about this kind of a little bit. It was talking about how to prepare for divorce. And I remember it said that prenuptial agreements, what's in the text is what the courts care about, not saying, well, he promised me that if we, in this case, if we had kids, he would tear it up, or he promised me that it was meaningless, that it was just something his parents wanted, and that he didn't really believe in it. So I know I'm cheating a little bit, because I know that just sort of word of mouth or just sort of verbal or oral agreements about whether or not they believe that the prenuptial agreement will go away, that's not true. So again, maybe we should just create a cooling off period, because the 4 days before the wedding feels a little rushed. But at the same time, what did he think? What did she think was going to happen if she didn't sign it, that they were still going to get married? I guess you can always do a post-nuptial agreement, right?
Sure.
Which I like to just call a nuptial. But I guess that would just have to be the day of, I don't know. Prenup and a post-nup. So there's always sort of that, at least timeline, if you're somebody who plans on when you're going to get married. And again, I think you have to, even when you apply for a marriage license, right? Don't you have to say when you're getting married? So there's always going to be that sort of, if we don't sign this by this time, we're either not going to get married or we won't have a prenuptial agreement, right? The case didn't say, did they have kids?
Did they have, by the time that
that they got divorced?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So I guess I have to say, well, let me see if there's any other questions.
No such luck.
I want some questions to help me.
Nope. On the spot here.
Come on, anybody have any questions? I guess I'd have to say, given what we just learned about the last case, that, can we go back to the slide again, just so I can see? Because now I'm getting a little bit confused, I think. Okay. They negotiated over a long period of time, 4 days before the wedding, signed off. Elizabeth gets some property and alimony, and Panagiotis, I like that.
And if I pronounce that name, I apologize to all Greek people everywhere.
I like that. If they have children. Well, okay. I know that, frankly, it doesn't really matter in terms of child support because of what we just learned. Mm-hmm. So what child support she would get doesn't matter. The property, based on what we learned in the last case, I think the property should be upheld. I think the alimony maybe depends on how drastic a situation it is and what some alimony means, and then child support would be determined separately, unless there's hold on, we got a question. What would happen if they had kids after a divorce? Can someone still take a partner to court for alimony, child support, even if there is no marriage anymore? Ooh, that's a really good question.
So you can always bring somebody to child support, but you only get alimony if you're married or if you're getting divorced.
Oh, interesting.
Now you can do what's called seek to modify a maintenance award. That's probably a little bit outside the realm of what we're talking about today. The answer is yes with a but with a caveat.
Okay. So really, it's the alimony piece that I'm curious to hear about. But do you want to stop the share?
Stop the share here. So actually, the court throws out the agreement.
Really?
Yep. So there's a trial, which finds all of these facts. All of the facts that I recited were not necessarily what they agreed on, but what the trial court found. And the trial court found that and decided the agreement should go out, and the appeals court agreed and said when he made those promises, the promises to rip up the agreement, the promise that he would share all those things, when he made those promises, he basically induced her to sign the agreement under false pretenses.
Wow. That's shocking.
Oh, no child support if no marriage. Sorry, you get child support no matter what, whether you're married or not. Child support is irrespective of whether you're married.
It was alimony that you don't get.
Alimony that you don't get.
Which is spousal support.
Spousal support.
So you don't get spousal support if you're not married. Child support you absolutely do get whether you're married or not.
Correct.
Okay. So that's really interesting. So the sort of, I don't want to say threats that he made, but the agreements that he said of, oh, it won't mean anything if we have kids, or, oh, I'll rip it up. Because he said them before she signed it, that's the difference between whether or not the prenuptial agreement holds or not?
Not really.
Not really.
The difference was that the court looked at the whole factual scenario and felt that given everything, first of all, that they believed that he made these promises. It wasn't just that she said it. They believed it, given the circumstances, given his testimony, all of those things. And also the surrounding situation, right? That she's under all of this pressure. She's been with this man for some period of time. It's 4 days before the wedding. He's threatening to stop the wedding. Maybe that threat's real. Maybe it's not. And then he makes these promises that are clearly what caused her to say, you know what? I will sign this document that I don't think is a good document because you've made these promises.
Okay. Interesting.
So the takeaway, the takeaway here is that yes, we expect adults to make agreements, right? We expect them to make agreements knowingly and intelligently, and you can't go back and say, well, I didn't really mean it, or I made a bad choice. But we also expect two people who are getting married to each other to at some level treat each other right? Mm-hmm. To treat each other with dignity, with honesty, with some level of appropriate behavior. And if you don't do that, and if you really are bad, we're not going to necessarily let you get away with it. And if you're asking me what the rule is, I'm not sure you could say that without knowing the facts of each case, what the rules are. Right? There's a lot of cases that you can cite that say just because it happens right before the wedding, that's not enough to throw out an agreement.
Okay.
Just because you don't speak the language, that's not enough to throw out an agreement. Just because you didn't have that much time to talk to a lawyer, or your spouse paid for the lawyer, that doesn't necessarily mean it. You got to look at the whole picture, and really again, the question is, do I think that this was conscionable? Does it shock my conscience what he did? What
unconscionable?
And both, by the way, in terms of the substance of the agreement and the process that you got there,
buddy. Okay. So there's another question about this specific case, and then I have a general question. So why did the court find the verbal agreement enforceable, or the oral agreement enforceable? Did he deny that he told her he'd tear it up?
So here's the thing. I mean, I guess that is ultimately what happens, right? In that they tear up the agreement. But that's not what the court decided. It's not that, let's say that he had promised, if we have kids, I'll give you $1 billion, right? So, it's some promise over and above ripping up the agreement. I don't believe that they would have held him to that promise, because I don't think they would have said that's an enforceable contract. But what they said was, you basically tricked her, right? By making these promises that you had no intention of going through with. That's sort of and I probably should have mentioned that. That's kind of the key thing here that they say, is that he made these promises and he never had any intention of going through with them. So it was a trick. It was a dirty trick. It wasn't just, oh baby, I love you, I'll do whatever for you. It was a trick. So when you do that, when you trick somebody into signing an agreement, we're not gonna let you get away with that. We're gonna invalidate the agreement.
Okay, that makes more sense. So my question.
We were asked what false pretenses. That kind of answers the question, right? I'll rip up the agreement if we have children. They had children. He didn't rip up the agreement. He never had any intention
to rip up the agreement if they have kids. Okay. So my question to you is, like, how should people go into these prenuptial agreements with an eye toward protecting themselves? A lot of people, when they find out you're a divorce attorney, ask about prenuptial agreements. A lot of people have asked me, because they know I'm married to a divorce attorney, like, oh, did you have a prenup? And we did. And I thought it was a really great experience. Not that we had anything to really squabble over, but I thought it was a really good way to open up the conversation about sort of finances and about worst case scenario planning with someone that you love, to say, hey, where do you think what do you think is fair? I thought it in a weird way. It was sort of like economic couples counseling that everyone should sort of do before they get married. I thought it was a really, really good process for us. That aside, if you're setting up a prenuptial agreement to really protect yourself, should things go wrong, it's the same thing. We don't intend to have our home destroyed in a natural disaster or otherwise, ruined from violence or whatever, but we have property insurance, right? We don't intend to lose our job, but we pay into unemployment insurance. So when you're thinking about how to best protect yourself should the worst happen, what should you keep in mind?
Well, look, I think you need to keep in mind what are the reasons that you're trying to get one. Is it that sort of notion of fire insurance, right? Look, if the worst happens, I don't want to have a nasty fight over something. Is it about protecting some asset that maybe it's your family's asset? You don't want to have a fight about who it belongs to, and that kind of a thing. Really, really think about that and try and tailor your agreement to protect the things you're trying to protect. If you're going into, and this is not something that I've experienced really that often, but if you're going into, we have this notion of the prenup is to stick it to them. And with the cases that I gave you, you get that sense a little bit, especially with the first one. But if you go into it with that, that's not the best. It's not going to be a healthy thing, right? Like I said, the goal of these things is to be able to sign it and put it away and never look at it again. It shouldn't be how you run your life. It should be giving yourself a little bit of protection in the event that the worst happens, sort of like fire insurance.
Okay. So if one of the parties gives false information while you're going through this prenuptial agreement, so in that case, saying we'll rip it up if we have kids, which he never intended to do, so that was false information, does that constitute fraud?
So this is going a little bit off the beaten path of what we're talking about. But fraud in this context, like really any context, is about a lie that's intentional, that causes somebody to rely on that lie to that person's detriment. Okay. So in this case, right. So if I say to you, like, honey, it's okay that I'm only giving you a quarter of what I make because I'm going to make $1 billion. Right. And I don't, that's not fraud, because even if it turns out not to be true, I believed it. I believed it when I said it, or I was hopeful that it is. I was optimistic. It's about, do you know that you're lying when you say it? And does that person then make a decision on that basis? And in the Petrakis case, right, he knew that he had no intention of ripping up that agreement. And he knew that by saying that to her, that was what was going to get her to sign an agreement that she had no interest in signing, right? So, and then she did.
So it is. In this case,
in this case, it's fraud.
Wow. Okay, a few more comments have come in. Is it worth saying things shouldn't happen if divorce? Like if I don't say I will not have to return the gifts in the case of divorce, does that mean I could be required to?
So,
I see.
Yeah, anything that you don't deal with in agreement, right? So let's say that you have a prenuptial agreement. You could have it be very, very narrow if you want. Let's say that the only thing I want to talk about in this agreement is what happens to this cell phone if we get divorced, right? I've got my cell phone. I want to make sure I keep my cell phone if we get divorced, even if she makes the cell phone pretty, even if the cell phone appreciates in value, because that's certainly what happens with old cell phones. I want to make sure that at the end of the day, I get to keep it. You can do that, but then it's not then going to cover the rest of the universe, right? It's not going to cover this remote control or this glass, right? So you can make an agreement as broad or as narrow as you really want it to be. And it's just about then, having professionals draft it in a way that makes sure that you're getting out of it what you want to get out of it, and not necessarily covering situations that you don't want it to cover.
Okay. And then the last comment that we have here, which I think is a really nice way to sort of wrap this up, is that this person likes the theory that a prenuptial agreement, or that it can be a good thing to enter a prenuptial agreement because you're thinking about how to break up at a time when you both love and like each other and are likely to be the most generous and fair.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
100% agree with that. It's tough. It is tough talking about money. It's tough talking about the prospect of the end of your relationship. It's tough in some ways. You're putting yourselves in not necessarily an adversarial position, but in some ways, you are, right? Because it's a zero sum. For every percent I get is a percent less that you get. But I believe that it's also the best idea is you don't want to discuss these difficult topics when you already are angry and you don't have an incentive to try and make it work, right? When you don't have an incentive to do the right thing, when you don't have an incentive to be more generous, because if you're waiting until you're getting divorced because you're getting divorced for some reason, it's going to be much more painful. As difficult as sometimes these conversations are, it will be 10 times more painful to have that same discussion in front of a judge, or in front of a mediator, or with your lawyers yelling at each other across the table. Not that we do that much yelling, but it's make plans while it's not a crisis. I think that applies to a lot of things, and it definitely applies to prenups.
Great.
All right.
Well, thank you so much.
So in any event, thank you all for joining us on this Facebook Live. This has been the Unhitching Hour. We are on Facebook Live once a week, this time 5:30. We're also on YouTube, so please check out our YouTube page, like and subscribe to that. I am Reid Aronson. So this is the Unhitching Hour, how the law works when your relationship doesn't. I am Reid Aronson. This is Vanessa Aronson. And we hope you'll come join us next week. Stop by. Have a great night. Have a great one. Great 4th of July, everybody. Bye.